the alimentary canal. So that is just another term that you might see. And so we're going to talk about the different layers of the alimentary canal. So in your book, there is a diagram showing a cross section through the structures. And so one of the things that's really interesting about this is that when we get to the stomach, we start to see that the epithelial tissue is actually very thin, and it is referred to as the mucosa. So the innermost layer of the, next to the lumen, so we can talk about the innermost layer. Yes, next to the lumen. So the lumen is just the space in the digestive tract, and that is a common word used for everything. So the lumen of a blood vessel, for example, the lumen of a body cavity. Okay. So the mucosa consists of the epithelial tissue. And from here on out, that epithelial tissue is actually simple columnar. So this is the case for this in the stomach and in the intestines. And so remember that simple means that it is a single layer, and column-shaped means that it looks like this. Right, so we have these column-shaped cells. And the reason for this is that we need to have lots of secretion. So we're going to look at the glands that are in the mucosa. And then we also, in the case of the intestines, we have to have absorption. So things have to be able to pass through that mucosa. Okay. The next part that you need to know is what is referred to as the submucosa. And so in the submucosa, we actually have, this is underneath the mucosa, we actually have connective tissue. And this is where we have blood vessels and we have lymphatic vessels. So blood and lymphatic vessels. And we're going to talk about the importance of the lymphatic system to the absorption of fats. And then we also have nerves. So the part of the nervous system that is in control of the movement of the smooth muscle, like in peristalsis, is what is referred to as the enteric nervous system. So this is what they call the gut brain. So we're going to talk about the importance of that in regulating secretions. So we have stimulation of the mucosa to secrete gastric juice, for example, into our stomach. And then we also have the nerves that regulate the peristalsis, so the churning of the stomach would also be regulated by those nerves that are in our submucosa. The next thing that we have is the muscularis. So the muscularis is muscle tissue, specifically smooth muscle. And it has different layers. And so in most of the digestive system, there is just circular muscles that when they contract, they would cause the lumen to become smaller. And then we also have longitudinal muscles. So there's two layers of those muscle tissues. We'll talk about in the stomach, there's actually a third layer, which is oblique, which means that the muscle fibers run at an angle. So here you can see in this particular instance, this is the circular muscle and the longitudinal muscle. So the longitudinal muscle, when it contracts, it's going to cause a shortening of the tube. And when it shortens, it actually gets wider. So this would be constriction where it gets narrower, and this would actually cause it to get wider. So that is actually going to help to move the food through the digestive system in one direction. Okay, so the outer part is, I'm running out of room here, so I'm going to say up here, this is the serosa. This actually has another name, and it is called the visceral peritoneum. So like we talked about the pericardium, which is around the heart, the pleural cavity is, or the pleural membrane is around the lungs. The peritoneum is actually around the digestive organs. And so the peritoneum, the visceral peritoneum, is going to eventually connect to the parietal peritoneum, and it actually holds the organs in place. So if we, this would be connective tissue. It is related to the idea of mesenteries. And I decided that we're actually going to do our fetal pig dissection this Friday, and then we're going to do nutrition and digestion the following Friday. So this week we're going to do the digestive systems in the fetal pig. And so when you're opening up the fetal pig, you'll notice, and trying to look at the organs, you'll notice that they are connected. They're actually connected to the outer membrane of the abdominal wall. And so this space that is fluid filled is what is referred to as the peritoneal cavity. Right? So it is a fluid filled space where the abdominal organs sit. Right? And so they're actually connected. Here you can see the liver is connected. It is actually considered to be an accessory organ because it's not actually part of the tube, the digestive tube that runs through your body. So this would be the lumen of the digestive system right there. And then we have the cavity, right? The peritoneal cavity. And then we have around the organs, that's the visceral peritoneum. And then lining this cavity is what is referred to as the parietal peritoneum. So the parietal, these are words that we've seen, the visceral pleura and the parietal pleura, right? So parietal peritoneum. This aligns the body cavity. Right. And we'll talk about a little bit about if there's a rupture of the digestive tract, like even in the appendix or in the large intestine, sometimes you can get infection in your peritoneal cavity, and that's called peritonitis. So peritonitis is an infection. Peritonitis, peritoneal. Oh, I don't know how to spell that. Look it up. Peritonitis. We get rid of tinnitus. Yep. Okay. So it's just peritonitis. Okay. So that would be inflammation. Anytime you see this itis, that means inflammation. So this is the inflammation of the peritoneal cavity. And so that can be really bad because that could lead to systemic infection, sepsis, where the bacteria produce so many toxins that it can lead to death really easily. And so sometimes they have to go in and flush the body cavity out and give people really strong antibiotics to cure an infection when it gets into the body cavity, okay, the abdominal cavity. Okay, so next we're going to talk about the stomach. And remember that it is below the diaphragm. It's located below the diaphragm. And there is a little sphincter that keeps stuff from going the opposite way, right, up into the esophagus. Now, if we detect that there are toxins in your food, you do have in your brainstem, the medulla oblongata, a visceral reflex center where you can induce vomiting, right? So you can vomit stuff up if you sense in your body that that substance has toxins. And so some bacteria that produce that 24-hour stomach flu produce toxins that are sensed by your brain, your nervous system, and causes the substances to move up and out, right? So the stomach is important because one of the things that it does is it actually stores food. And liquid, right? And water. So they say that the stomach can actually expand up to 2 liters, right? So it's a big liter bottle, 2 of those, 2 liters. Probably depends upon if you're used to eating large meals, then your stomach tends to be probably bigger than if you're not used to eating large meals, right? So the reason why it can store food is that it has internal rugae. And so those rugae are folds. That allow it to expand. And you actually have stretch receptors in these folds. So stretch receptors in the smooth muscle that tell you when you have taken in too much food. So you can sense how big or how expanded your stomach is. Now, this means that we don't have to eat continuously. Right? So I could be a person and I could just eat 1 large meal a day and get all of my nutrients. I wouldn't have to eat 3 times a day or 6 times a day. I could theoretically just eat maybe once a day, right? And so this just means that you don't have to eat continuously. Now, some people, in order to lose weight, actually reduce the storage capacity of their stomach. So this is where you would go in and you would do, used to be that they would staple the stomach, right, to reduce its storage capacity. Sometimes they use a band that keeps the stomach from expanding, right? So I think that band can either be loosened or tightened, the lap band, right? And so what that does is that just keeps people from eating excessive amounts of food, right? And that could lead to them possibly losing weight. But remember that you can eat little bits of food all day long and, all the time and still get too many calories, right? So that function sometimes is good, sometimes is bad, depending upon how you eat. Okay, so the other thing is that there is one thing that you actually have to have your stomach for, and it produces, we have the production of intrinsic factor. So they say that this is the only life-giving reason why you would have to have a stomach. So theoretically, you could remove the stomach and nothing would happen. I mean, you would probably have a hard time digesting your food, but you could still get the nutrients, and you could still survive. But without intrinsic factor, you cannot. And so you would give them supplements of intrinsic factor if they did not have a stomach. And so this aids in the absorption of a vitamin, specifically of vitamin B12. So without this, you cannot absorb this vitamin from your nutrients. And this is an essential vitamin that you have to have in order to survive. So we'll talk more about vitamins when we get to nutrition. Okay, we also have mechanical digestion taking place in the stomach. So this is the churning of the food. So the stomach contracts, and sometimes it will start contracting even when you just smell food. So that is if you have like an empty stomach and you haven't eaten in a while and you smell food or you think about food or whatever it is, your stomach will start to contract. And that is that growling sound because there's nothing in your stomach, so there's air in there, right? And it actually creates a sound. So growling stomach has to do with that for some reason your stomach has started churning even though there is no food in it to digest. We also have chemical digestion. And this occurs in the gastric pits. So we actually have the epithelial tissue kind of infolding. Gastric means stomach, and so it's an infolding of the epithelial tissue. And in these gastric pits, we have different types of cells. So we have parietal cells. Parietal cells produce hydrochloric acid. So hydrochloric acid is super acidic, and this is the mechanism for protecting against bad things that you take into your body, right? The other types of cells are called the chief cells, and they produce or secrete an inactive enzyme called pepsinogen. So it's really important that when we think about this digestion is we realize that chemical digestion could also occur in the digestive tract. So we have to have a mechanism by which enzymes are only activated once they get into the lumen. So pepsinogen is an inactive enzyme that is secreted to protect the lining of the actual cells from self-digestion. So this is an inactive enzyme. Notice that this enzyme does not have that ACE ending, right? So pepsinogen in the presence of hydrochloric acid, so that would be in the lumen of your stomach, is converted to pepsin. So pepsin is an important enzyme because it breaks down proteins. So it breaks peptide bonds between amino acids. So protein digestion begins in the stomach, whereas that starch digestion, carbohydrate digestion, occurs in the mouth. The other important thing about this HCl, right? So it protects against infection, so against bad bacteria and fungi. That we're taking in with our food. But it also helps to denature proteins, right? So it denatures proteins, so it unfolds them. So under acidic conditions, proteins go from being globular to denatured, which means they unfold, so that pepsin is able to, this is interesting, the pepsin is an enzyme that's able to work under low acidic conditions. Most enzymes do not work under really acidic conditions. Okay, so it denatures proteins and it breaks down connective tissue. Right. So if you were to eat a steak, for example, when you take it in, there's lots of connective tissue that surrounds the individual muscle fibers, and that, so when you think about a steak, it is full of connective tissue because of the muscle fibers and the fascicles in the muscle. And so this actually has to break that down, right? And then for you to be able to get access to the proteins that are in the muscle tissue, including actin and myosin, that cause muscle contraction. And so it's harder to digest proteins if your stomach is not acidic. Specifically, animal protein is hard to digest. That's the hydrochloric acid. So it breaks down the connective tissue, breaks it apart, so that pepsin can gain access to all of the proteins that are in the muscle tissue. Now, unfortunately, there is a bacteria that is able to survive in these acidic conditions, and it is called Helicobacter pylori. Or you might hear it as, this is the genus and this is the species, as H. pylori. Okay, so this is a bacteria that they now believe almost, a lot of people have, but in some people, this is actually the culprit that causes an infection in the stomach and can lead to gastric ulcers. So they used to believe that, even when I had ulcers 20 years ago from graduate school, right? So they used to think that if you had gastric ulcers, it was stress and it was diet. So they would put you on stress-reducing lifestyle and they would change your diet because they thought that stress caused more acid to be produced, which the acid can actually digest if there's not a mucous membrane, right? So these bacteria can get through the mucous membrane and can cause bleeding in the stomach. And so now what they do, if you go to the doctor and you have gastric ulcers, if he doesn't mention H. pylori, you should mention it, because they have tests to detect whether or not you have that. And if that's causing the ulcers, you really need an antibiotic to take care of it. So no amount of reducing stress and changing your diet is going to cure your ulcers if they're caused by this, the helico. There's a C in there. I'll write it in. Helicobacter. Okay. Helicobacter. Okay. So this breaks through the mucous membrane. So the mucous membrane is super important for protecting the stomach from self-digestion. Oops, mucous membrane, there's an E there, membrane. So anything that actually is going to be destructive to the mucous membrane can also lead to ulcers. So what are some stuff that you've heard of that could cause stomach bleeding? What's something that you could take that would cause your stomach to bleed?
Too much aspirin?
Yes, aspirin. Aspirin causes stomach bleeding. So aspirin gets through this mucous membrane and causes the stomach to start to digest itself, right? So aspirin is one, and then alcohol is another. So this is why they recommend that you do not take alcohol on an empty stomach, because it is absorbed right across the lining of the stomach, right? And the other one would be salt. So salt can also cause bleeding. So the worst thing you could do probably for your stomach is, after a day of not eating, is to drink alcohol, eat salted potato chips, and take aspirin, right? Because that's going to cause your stomach to just
Is that why they tell you to take aspirin after you eat food?
Yes, and the same thing with alcohol. It slows the absorption down, but it also helps to protect the mucous membrane from the alcohol. Yep. Okay. So this is my diagram of my stomach, and I mentioned that the stomach actually has 3 layers of smooth muscle. This is the only place where we see 3 layers. So in the intestine and the esophagus, it's just 2 layers. So you'll notice that the 3rd layer is, do they have it layers? Oh yeah, the oblique layer. So that is the innermost layer here, and it's called oblique because the muscle fibers run at a diagonal, and that's what oblique means, at a diagonal, rather than circular, which would be around, and longitudinal, which would be down the length of the organ. So oblique, that's right, listed right here. So there's an oblique layer. The opening to the stomach is sometimes referred to as the cardiac valve, or the cardiac sphincter. So you'll remember that we talked about that. That's the same thing as the gastroesophageal sphincter. So if you hear cardiac, That's just because that's called the cardia. So that part of the stomach is called the cardia. And so the cardiac sphincter is where the esophagus enters the stomach. Your stomach sits off to your left side. So in order to prevent acid from getting up and into your esophagus, sometimes it's recommended that you sleep on your left side of your body. On your right side, then your stomach is going to be above your esophagus, and that's going to cause more acid to move into the esophagus, right? The other sphincter here is the pyloric sphincter. And this is what prevents excessive substances from getting into the small intestine. So it just opens up a little bit, and a little bit of the gastric juice and food gets shot into the small intestine at a time, because the small intestine is not resistant to acid. And so if too much stuff gets into the small intestine all at once, it cannot neutralize the acid, and it will actually cause damage to your small intestine. So this prevents excessive chyme. So chyme is a term you need to know, C-H-Y-M-E, and that is gastric juice plus food. So once gastric juice has digested it, it's turned it into mush. It's just like, you know, it would be liquidy to us, right? Then it gets put into the first part of the small intestine. So it prevents excessive chyme from entering the small intestine. And you notice that that pylori was the name of that bacteria, right? H. pylori might be related to, or is related to that idea, the pyloric sphincter or valve. Okay, so if we look at these gastric pits, so this is in the mucosa. So you notice that the mucosa is lined by that simple columnar epithelial tissue. And so here we have the parietal cells producing lots of hydrochloric acid. Notice that it's located up near the lumen, because you don't want the hydrochloric acid to destroy the cells that are lining the gastric pits. And then we have the chief cells that are producing the pepsinogen, and then as it comes up, it gets converted into pepsin within the lumen. You'll also notice that there are a couple of other types of cells. Actually, they don't have the goblet. The goblet cells are what secrete the mucus. But we're going to talk about the enteroendocrine glands, or enteroendocrine cells. So if you look at this word inside the enteric system, right? Endocrine means hormone. So these secrete a hormone called gastrin. That's easy to remember because that's the gastrin is like stomach, right? Gastric juice, gastrin. So this is actually a hormone that then actually stimulates more digestive secretion. So this stimulates greater secretions and motility. So that means that it causes the stomach to secrete more hydrochloric acid, and it also causes it to churn and move the food through the digestive system much more quickly. Okay. So we can talk about how we can regulate the secretion of gastric juice, and there are 3 phases. 3 phases. So the first phase is called the cephalic phase. So what does cephal mean? Anybody remember? Does that mean cephalic? Your head. Excellent. Okay. So this takes place in the cerebral cortex, or actually it would be part of the conscious brain. So we'll just put conscious brain. Smells food or thinks about eating. Now, do you think that the sympathetic or the parasympathetic nervous systems regulate digestion? Parasympathetic, right? Because that's the rest and relaxation, digestion. Sympathetic is the fight or flight. So this sends a signal via the vagus nerve. To the stomach. And this is when secretions start. Now, interestingly, one of the ways that they used to treat really bad heartburn, so imagine if you had like really bad heartburn 70 years ago, or maybe 60 years ago, maybe 50 years ago even, what they would do is that they would actually cut the connection between the vagus nerve and the stomach. And so then the vagus nerve couldn't send a signal to the stomach, so less gastric juice would be secreted, but it also would decrease its motility, right? So it actually made it a little bit harder for them to digest. But one of the crazy things about your digestive tract is that you can remove it from, like in a rat, you can take it out of the rat's body and it will still secrete and it will still have motility. So it will still contract. And so the crazy thing about your stomach is that's why they call it the gut brain, is that it doesn't actually have to be connected to your brain at all to work. So they've done lots of experiments where they've severed that vagus nerve, even in humans, to relieve excessive gastric juice production. Okay. The second phase is called the gastric phase. So this is when the stomach distends, right? So it gets full, right? So you have distension of the stomach. So I'll just put stomach distends. So it gets full, okay? And food is detected, right? So then the gastric phase is coordinated by the release of the gastrin and the release of more hydrochloric acid and pepsinogen. And then finally, we have what is referred to as the intestinal phase. And this is interesting because this actually can shut down and decrease what is happening in your stomach. So the intestinal phase actually protects the intestine from excessive acidic chyme. So if your intestine, the cells that are in your intestine, specifically duodenum, which is the first, or the duodenum, which is the first part of the intestine, if it detects that there's lots of food that's coming through that is not properly digested, or if it detects that there's excessive amount, like the stomach is just like dumping excessive amounts, it will actually shut down the motility of the stomach. So this can decrease motility in the stomach. So more digestion takes place. It can also decrease gastric or juice production. And gastric juice production. So that's one of the really important aspects of that intestinal phase. It's a negative feedback mechanism. Okay, so in your new book and in your old book, they have these diagrams that show the effects. So the sight or thought of food, the smell, that goes via the vagus nerve. That's stimulatory. So in this diagram, red is stimulatory and blue is inhibitory. So loss of appetite due to depression, for example, and then it just inhibits stomach secretion activity. Right? You don't take in food, you're not hungry, right? The gastric phase, right? So if you have stomach getting big and if you get food chemicals, then that is going to increase the secretion. And then if you have emotional stress, the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight, is actually going to override the parasympathetic controls, and that inhibits stomach activity. So you probably have all experienced having to eat under stressful situations, right? So I personally hate it when we have a meeting at school where we're going to be like fighting about something, you know, or arguing about something, and then they serve food. It's like, are you kidding me? Nobody wants to eat, you know, because then you just like, you're sitting there and you've eaten and you're like, your stomach is like, it's not working at all because your sympathetic nervous system is like, right? Okay. And then the presence of low pH could stimulate secretion, but this is important is that when you have too much acid, you have too much chyme or other irritants, then that's going to inhibit the stomach secretory activity. Okay, small intestine is next. So the things that happen in the small intestine, the most important part for chemical digestion is called the duodenum. So there's actually 3 sections. And depending upon where you're from, you say it different. So I've heard it pronounced duodenum or duodenum. Okay. The next one is the jejunum. E-U-M. Jejunum. And then we have the ileum. So that is in order. So the duodenum is the very first part. So that is what receives the chyme. And then the jejunum and the ileum are important in absorption of nutrients. And then the ileum actually connects to the large intestine. So we can talk about chemical digestion. So in the small intestine, the duodenum is connected to the pancreas. So you'll remember from when we talked about hormones, or if you remember talking about insulin, for example, that is produced by the pancreas. But the pancreas is also an accessory gland or an accessory organ that produces enzymes. And these enzymes are not secreted into the blood. They are transported via a duct. So this would be an exocrine function because exocrine glands have ducts. So you have a pancreatic duct that dumps enzymes into the duodenum. Okay. We have all kinds of chemicals or enzymes coming from this. So for example, we have lipase, right, that digests lipids. Right. We have an enzyme called trypsin, which is protein. And then we also have nucleases that digests DNA. So you can break down the DNA that is in your food. And then we also have pancreatic amylase. So that digests what type of chemical? What type of molecule? Carbohydrates, sugars, right? So the digestion of lipids, proteins, DNA, and carbohydrates, okay, can take place in the stomach. Now the pancreas, when we do our dissection, and even when you look at it in a cadaver, when you open up the body cavity, it is not like a separate organ like the liver or the stomach or the spleen. And it just kind of sits in the mesentery, and it is essentially a digestive gland. So when we look at it on the diagram, okay, you'll notice that this is the yellow is my pancreas. And it is just situated in those mesenteries that connect all of the organs to one another and the organs to the body cavity, holding everything in place. So we have this pancreatic duct right here. So this pancreatic duct is going to dump stuff into that first part of the small intestine, which is the duodenum. Now you'll also notice that we have connected to the duodenum the gallbladder. And so that is another type of digestion. So the gallbladder stores bile that is produced in the liver. Some people get their bile duct clogged up, or the cystic duct that carries the, so you can get gallstones if you have too much cholesterol, too much fat. The bile can combine with the fat and produce gallstones. So gallstones block the duct. And they are supposedly really painful, maybe not as painful as kidney stones, but the gallstones block the duct, and then sometimes the gallbladder becomes inflamed and you actually have to have it removed. And then if you have it removed, what do you want to limit from your diet? Greasy foods, right? So the bile is responsible for the mechanical digestion of fats. So bile emulsifies, or emulsification of fats. So this is kind of like chewing. It's an example of mechanical digestion that takes place by a chemical, but it's not an enzyme. Bile is not an enzyme. So what it does is it takes, I'll write it up here, you have large fat globules. And the larger they are, the less surface area they have. They're not soluble in water, so they're in your digestive tract, and they're hydrophobic, so they're repelled by water, so they tend to form up into large globules. And the enzymes can't get access to them very well, so the bile turns it into, like a detergent, into small fat droplets. Okay, so now we have a large surface area over which the lipases can then come in and break down the lipids, and so that you can absorb them across the surface of the intestine. So again, bile is not an enzyme, so it wouldn't be chemical digestion. It is like a detergent. So it's like when you wash your dishes and you can't get that greasy pan clean, and then you put detergent in it, and all of a sudden the fat kind of dissipates into smaller pieces and can be washed off, right? So that's the same thing that the bile does, is it increases the surface area so enzymes can attach. Okay, I think I have one more image here. Yes. So this is just a picture showing the common bile duct. So this would release bile into this first part of the small intestine, and then you have the pancreatic ducts as well. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the absorption of nutrients in the small intestine, because this is where the vast majority of nutrients are absorbed. A little bit takes place in the large intestine, but mostly in the small intestine. And so the histology is such that this increases the surface area so that more absorption takes place. Okay, so we have a large surface area. And it's kind of interesting because you can see this in the evolution of animals. When you look at an earthworm, they have a really long intestine that they absorb nutrients from the soil that they eat, but they don't have a very large surface area. They don't have the increase in the surface area that we do. Okay. So when you look at the surface area, we have folds. Right? So those folds are going to have a lot more surface area than if there were no folds. Right? So these are the intestinal folds. But if you look at this, so if I enlarged that, you would actually see that my intestine actually looks like this. My one fold would actually kind of look like this, right? And so you can see that there's folds upon folds, and these are what are referred to as villi. And then if you looked at one villi, the surface is composed of cells, but the cells have this cilia, and this is called the microvilli. So each of the cells on the villi have cilia called microvilli. So these are cilia extending from the simple columnar epithelial tissue. I'll just put simple columnar. This has another name, and you might hear it. It's called the brush border. And you hear it specifically because in the brush border, within those cytoplasmic extensions, we have enzymes. So there's can be enzymes embedded in these cilia. So they're actually embedded in the plasma membrane of the cilia. And they are called brush border enzymes. And an example of this is lactase. So what do you think lactase breaks down? Lactose, right? So lactose is a milk sugar. So it breaks down milk sugar. So babies are born with these brush border enzymes, but as you mature, in most mammals, those brush border, the lactase specifically, does not get put into the plasma membrane. And so most humans on the planet today are lactose intolerant as adults, right? But this is just one example of an enzyme that is a brush border enzyme. But there's other ones that function in the final digestion of proteins as well as other carbohydrates. Okay. So in your book, you can see that, again, these folds are not to allow the intestine, the small intestine, to get bigger, but just to increase the surface area. So you can see the folding upon folding. So this would be the folds. Each one of these is a villus finger. And then on the cells, these would be the microvilli. So when we look at the absorption, each villi has capillaries and a lacteal. So the lacteal is green. So we know from studying the lymphatic system that the lymphatic system is usually drawn in green. So the lacteal is a lymphatic vessel. So one of the functions of the lacteal is of the lymphatic vessels is to transport fat. So fat that is absorbed, lipids, are not passed into the circulatory system. They are absorbed by the lymphatic system. So this makes sense because if you ate like a milkshake and French fries and a hamburger, right, all of the lipids would get dumped into your circulatory system and they could potentially clog it up. And so by putting your lipids into your lymphatic system, you could dilute it in the lymph, and then it gets passed back up into circulation up near the neck region, right? So that's another function of the lymphatic system in terms of its digestive function and absorption function. Now, the one thing about lipids is that they are not transported directly in solution. They actually have to have proteins bound to them. So if we look at lipid absorption, okay, so this is my fatty acid that then goes into the inside of the cell. This would be my cilia, that's my brush border. And you'll notice that the lipids in the intestinal cells get modified, and they get modified into what are called chylomicrons. So lipids are packaged into chylomicrons. And the chylomicrons have a protein coat that makes them more soluble in water. Okay, so they're covered in proteins. Which make them more soluble in water. So a protein that helps to transport lipids is called a lipoprotein. And whether you know it or not, you've heard about lipoproteins. And does anybody want to guess where you might have heard of lipoproteins before? Cholesterol. So lipoproteins, there's some that are involved in the transport of cholesterol, because cholesterol is a lipid. And so when you get your cholesterol tested, you actually get tested for your LDL and your HDL, right? Cholesterol is all the same, but the transporting proteins are different. So you have the high density lipoprotein and you have the low density lipoprotein. Now in the brain, cholesterol is actually transported by an apolipoprotein. And interesting enough, they've discovered that early onset Alzheimer's people have a specific gene that causes a mutation in the apolipoprotein. So it's called ApoE. And ApoE can actually be correlated with increased Alzheimer's disease. So we'll talk more about that when we get to nutrition. But those lipoproteins are really important because if you don't transport the cholesterol properly, they could end up clogging the vessels in the brain. They could end up causing Alzheimer's, and they could also end up causing problems in your heart and your blood vessels. Okay. So if it is not a lipid, then if it is a nutrient that can be broken down and transported and is soluble in water, it gets picked up by the capillaries. So you'll notice here is a trypsin. This is chymotrypsin, is another type of trypsin. And what these do is these are breaking down the amino acids. So like trypsin would break that peptide bond right between those two amino acids. And then the amino acids get transported to the inside, right? And then they get passed to the circulatory system. So what that means is that water-soluble nutrients are taken up by the cell and passed to the capillaries. These enzymes that are on the brush border would be like lactase, right? They're brush border enzymes that are sitting right on the surface of those cilia that help to break down proteins and carbohydrates so that they can be absorbed. Now, where do you think these water-soluble nutrients go first after they have left the small intestine? Where might they go to be filtered? Not the spleen. The spleen filters blood of dead and damaged cells. What filters your blood of toxins and also stores glucose as glycogen? The liver, right? And so this is eventually going to be passed to what is called the hepatic portal system. So this is part of the circulatory system. Portal means that it goes between two organs before going back to the heart. So you might have remembered when we talked about the brain, we talked about the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system, right? So hepatic means liver. So we don't want nutrients just dumped into circulation. We want to process those. And then if any toxins get into circulation, we need to process those as well. So we're going to talk about the liver next. So the liver is surprisingly large. It's like every time we do a cadaver dissection and we open somebody up, it's like it looks like they're all one big liver, right? The liver is a very big, it's a very important organ in our body. It sits below the diaphragm, but it's connected via a ligament to the diaphragm. So it's kind of suspended from the diaphragm. So if we look at the structure or a picture of it, so this is from a cadaver. And so you can see this is the front part, so the anterior part. So it has different lobes. You have a right and a left lobe. And then this is just a ligament that corresponds to a blood vessel that you once had when you were a fetus. This is the gallbladder right there. So it kind of sits right underneath. It's not green, obviously, but that's what stores your bile. Okay. So when we look at the liver, we have lobes, right? So these are large segments, right and left, LT. But we also have lobules. So the lobules are tiny. So they say that they're kind of about the same size as a sesame seed. And these are actually the functional unit of the liver. So this is what actually the liver, the unit of function of what it does, okay? So when we look at these are hexagonal in shape. So hexagonal mean how many sided? 6. Okay. Pentagonal maybe would be 5. So hexagonal is 6-sided. And then at each of those sides, they have a portal triad. So each, not side, but each corner where the sides come together has a portal triad. Okay, so these are vessels. So we have what is referred to as the portal artery. And let me look at your diagram, because some of the diagrams say something different. Let me look at it quick. Okay, so they call it here the portal arteriole. Sorry, so it's the portal arteriole. So this is my functional unit, my lobule. Each side has these three vessels, and the flow of blood through this is it's going to pass through, and it's almost like pages of a book, right? It passes through this filtering system, right? And then it comes out through the central vein. So the portal arteriole is carrying oxygen-rich blood to the liver lobule, so specifically to the hepatocytes. So the hepatocytes are your liver cells. So they are kind of shown here. This would be an example of a hepatocyte, right? So they're actually kind of cuboidal. They're cube-shaped hepatocytes. So they're going to need oxygen in order to produce ATP to do their work of filtering the blood. We also have what is referred to as the portal venule. Oops, and there's no I in there. I get rid of the I. So the portal venule carries food-rich blood from the small intestine. So nutrient-rich. So that's my portal venule. And then we have the bile duct. So that's carrying bile, which is going to help to emulsify fat. Okay. So those are the three components of your portal triad, three vessels. And so the vessel that is going to carry the blood out of the lobule is called the central vein. So the central vein carries processed blood out of the lobule. So in this particular instance, it would be right here, right, the central part. So the blood flow or the through would all come out the central vein, and then it would come out the liver, come out of the liver eventually and go back to the heart, where it will be then pumped back out to the body. We also have macrophages. So notice that there's macrophages in these little ducts, and so they can help to break down things that should not be in the blood, and they can also help in destroying toxins. So if we look at the function of the liver,
Go back and go down.
oh yeah, sorry. So if we look at the function of the liver, so I'll just go to a new insert, not insert, view, topic. Function, this will be the last thing we'll talk about. Okay, so the function of the liver, okay, it breaks down toxins. right? So we know that like alcohol has to be broken down by enzymes produced by the liver. Other toxins that get in your body, it's really interesting, even from cigarette smoke, the liver will have to break down the toxins that get into the circulation. The other thing is that it stores glucose as glycogen. So glycogen is the way that we store glucose. Glucose is just chemically bonded together to produce a polysaccharide called glycogen. Glycogen is also stored in our muscles, but that is important so that when we don't eat, we have a ready supply of glucose, because specifically our nervous system needs glucose. It also removes amino acids as it removes glucose, and it produces blood clotting proteins. So those proteins in your blood are produced by the liver. The other things that it does is, we mentioned it produces bile. There was one more that I just... Anybody can think of what the last one I was going to say was? Oh, it stores iron. So it helps in the breakdown of hemoglobin.
Doesn't it grow back?
Yes, so it is regenerative. Some of your other organs are too. Like, I didn't know this. Somebody had most of their kidney removed, but they left a little bit of it and their kidney grew back, right? The problem is that you have to have a piece of it that is healthy. So oftentimes when people are in liver failure, they have so much cirrhosis going on that there's no healthy part of it that can regenerate itself. Yeah. So, so remember that we talked about bilirubin, right? When we were talking about newborns and the fact that they have to break down their fetal hemoglobin before they can produce adult hemoglobin. So when the hemoglobin can't be broken down, one sign of liver failure is jaundice. So bilirubin accumulation causes jaundice. So that's a sign of liver failure. Okay, so we'll stop there for today, and then we're going to talk about the large intestine, and then we're going to talk about some disorders of digestion, and then we'll move on to nutrition.